Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, if you could pick any place to live, where would it be and why? A conversation about livability next on Dialogue. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. Communities all over the world vie to be the most livable. But what does that mean and how do you create it? And what happens when a place becomes so desirable that too many people move there, making it potentially unlivable? My guest today has been thinking about these issues and working on them for more than 35 years. Robert McNulty is the founder and president of Partners for Livable Communities, a nonprofit that brings together the public and private sectors to help revitalize cities. Prior to founding Partners, Mr. McNulty was the assistant director for the National Endowment for the Arts, Architecture, and Environmental Arts program. He's in Boise to meet with a group of business leaders about developing partnerships to enhance the Treasure Valley. Welcome to Boise.
Thank you for having me.
Before we delve a little bit more into why you're here, livability.
Well,
it seems rather subjective. I mean, some people prefer warm weather places, some people prefer cold weather places, some people like big cities, some people like small, but there are generally agreed upon terms for what is considered a livable place, aren't there?
True. But I'm going to tell you the wisdom of a woman that I worked for named Nancy Hanks, who was a long-term associate of three of the Rockefeller brothers, head of the National Endowment for the Arts, and very distinguished. And she was the one that said, Bob, use the word livable. No one's against it, but no one quite knows what it means. Therefore, depending upon changing times, you can change the definition of what you need to do to make a community better, to be more livable. So it may be jobs in a recession or a difficulty. It may be equal opportunity in increasing diversity and people being in some conflict. It may be environmental values such as air and water and noise levels and open space. It may be how you take care of the older individual aging in place as a definition, a litmus test for a truly livable community, or maybe your children's achievements in school. So she said it's all those things, but if it's everything, then it's like the Powder River. It's a mile wide and inch deep, but there should be a goal of each decade of making it a better place, more livable, and that may be, in the case of Boise, I don't know, but there's many assets here, but there must be some challenges ahead in Boise.
I would think, though, that it would be not rocket science to say that most people would want clean air, clean water, low crime, good schools. Aren't there some kind of basics that
those are all basics,
communities
but there's trade-offs. For example, some people think the EPA air quality standards are too high and discourages industry, which discourages jobs, which they think may be making a higher income is more important than that particular clean air standard. So there's no absolutes. What you have is you need a balance of a quality of life. You need a quality of education so that you have skills for that job so your children can find a job in the future. You have to have a good urban fabric of both historic preservation and new addition that basically is pleasing. You have to have, I think, some open space and green. You have to have some environmental values that is both noise and air and water and countryside and open space. And you probably have to have human values, social capital. Are we doing something for people that are immigrants, that have difficulty with a disability? Are we investing in social capital as a caring community? So all those things are woven together in different packages by different communities.
So what you do is you go to these different communities, as you are here, and you help people work through these things to see which one of those values rises to the top, or which several ones. So talk a little bit more about what you're doing here, specifically with this group, as I mentioned, of business leaders. What are you helping them with? What are their concerns? What are they hoping to develop?
There's a personal connection. One of your local citizens, Doug Fowler, I met in a hotel 25 years ago in Lyon, France, and he has French roots. And at that time he was living in Phoenix, but he's now been living in Boise as a developer.
Of Harris Ranch.
Harris Ranch, and he joined my board of trustees and then has rejoined the board, and he said, Bob, do you know much about Boise? I said, no. He says, well, why don't you come and discover us? We're the gateway to the real West. And I've been here now 3 times, and he's indicated to me, he said, Bob, you've worked in cities where there have been civic partnerships put together, Chattanooga, Seattle, Colorado Springs, San Diego, that have taken that leap forward for a city being pretty good to a city being spectacular. He said, I think we need that sort of advocacy to take that leap forward for Boise for the next decade. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cities where I've worked, where there's been a civic partnership put together that has been the jet propulsion package that's moved that city dramatically ahead in the ranks of the most livable cities of America.
What would be the main concerns, though, that you'd be helping them with? Is it traffic? Is it?
Well, I think that there's a concern of regional cooperation. I think there's a concern of image. Does Boise have the brand and the image that it will live up to in terms of how hard people are willing to work to make the community a better place for themselves, their children, and for welcoming newcomers, investors that come here? I think the relationship between the private sector and the civic sector and government is not all that it could be, and hardly in any community is it all that it could be. In many of the communities where I've worked, the private sector has put together a partnership organization like the Denver Partnership, Operation Forward Progress or Forward Thrust in Seattle, the goals for Colorado Springs that was not government. It was done by the private sector to let government know what the citizens felt their goals should be in the next decade. And I think that that's a little bit of Doug thinking that maybe the private sector and the civic sector can be a partner in helping to set values and aspirations that may be useful to communicate to the elected and salaried officials of government.
If development is part of the main engine, does that necessarily mean that they want more development, relaxed rules so that they can develop more, so that there's ending up with more sprawl?
You know, that's a question that I don't know the answer to, but you know, since you're a statewide network, I would think that every community of any size is going through some issues of, is growth good? Is growth bad? How much is too little growth, too much growth? You know, does it bring newcomers? Do we like newcomers? Are we worried about the changing our character and our neighborliness? Both of my children live in Park City, which was once a copper town. Not copper, I'm sorry. It was Galena lead and silver, and then it went completely broke, and some hippies moved in to start skiing there in 1970, and in 1971 they had the riot of the miners beating up the skiers. And so it's now changed, and I'm on the board of the Community Foundation in Park City, so that's a balance in every community.
You mentioned this kind of regionalism, that there's sometimes a breakdown
Yes.
in communities working with each other past county borders,
Yes.
sometimes even past state borders.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And there is definitely, I've noticed, kind of a consternation or a fear about, you know, what with the old Council of Governments, or kind of this one world,
Yes.
top-down
Right.
regionalism. You know, how do you get? Is it a goal to get past that scary factor for some people,
Well,
or do you understand why they feel that
yeah,
way?
but I mean, wisdom is, whether it's wisdom from the Brookings Institute or common sense, if you can work with your neighbors, you can aggregate resources to solve problems. If you can't work with your neighbors, it's a lot harder to put together the willpower or the economic power to solve a problem.
But many people are fearful of government to begin with. Then you get multiple governments working together. Then
see,
they get even more afraid.
I'm talking about neighbors not in a government sense, but in goodwill of people living in adjacent communities. For example, Chattanooga, Tennessee, the mayor of Chattanooga is chairman of my board. Chattanooga was seen as by Walter Cronkite, declared as the dirtiest city in America. It's now the quality of life city in America. Volkswagen located their $1.5 billion lead platinum manufacturing facility there. They've been ranked as the best city in America. All of that took 20 years, but the vision came out of 10,000 people participating in a process of setting priorities. It wasn't government, it wasn't business, it was a civic process facilitated by professors from the School of Architecture at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga.
You mentioned lists and things like that being livable. You know, Boise has been on many of these lists, Outdoor Magazine and other lists.
It's a great place.
Top 10 places to live. But as I mentioned in my introduction, sometimes what happens is, and did happen in Boise, so many people moved in from, say, 93 to 2003, that there was definitely a marked change in the air quality, whether that was from additional cars or dust, vagrant dust from development, yes. And any number of changes in the school system, in outlying areas because more people were moving in. So where's this balance between promoting livability and then getting to the point where so many people see the name of the town on the list, they move there, and it becomes unlivable?
Well, we have a word that we call temporary paradise.
I'm sorry, slow down, what was it?
A temporary paradise.
Temporary paradise, yes.
If you don't want your community to be a temporary paradise, you have to put in place a cooperative, common, agreed upon management strategies that will manage the success that will be your undoing. And that the cities that are really good, and I'm not going to say Boulder is the best city in America, but Boulder, Colorado is the one city about your size that put in place a management strategy of managing temporary paradise so that they have a permanent solution to just about all the issues you're talking about. Except now, affordable housing. They do not have affordable housing. They do not have affordable housing.
Yeah.
And they don't have much diversity either.
I was going to say the reputation of Boulder is that it's a pretty high-end, rather expensive place to live, and many people of the same backgrounds.
That's exactly
politically, right. And which would go against what you were talking about, diversity.
I said diversity and affordability. I'm a social equity person. I think you can't be sustainable unless there's a balanced opportunity for everyone to move up, succeed.
Well, and that's segues into something else I wanted to ask, which is, as cities put in amenities to be more livable, and yes. I'll take, for example, we have a new kayak park in Boise. By the same token, there are people, on one side of the river, it was lower economic
yes.
class. Many of those trailer homes now are being moved away. Some people moved away on their own. I know somebody who lived there who no longer saw the eagles and everything that she used to see after the development happened. There was more people coming, parking their cars. So you can create an amenity
yes.
that then displaces other people who can no longer afford to live in the cool area anymore. How do you work with that?
Guilty. I'm guilty. No, change is the only constant in our communities today. Resiliency is the new term, and we're going to have to adapt to immigration as a demographic change, the aging of our population and their health issues. We're going to have to adapt to economic change. So any community that builds in a system of goodwill, that's more importantly, not just public goodwill, but citizen goodwill, a mixed public-private, on a regional basis, has probably the infrastructure to deal with those changes and ameliorate the negative impacts. But
let's say, hey, we're putting in this kayak park, we know it's going to affect you, we're going to physically move you to another place maybe? But
that's happening in every community in America. When they did the High Line in New York, which is a spectacular success, they obviously displaced some very low-income people living in the old meatpacking area. But there's a greater good. Now, I work in Cuba. I actually have a license for the U.S. Treasury to work in Cuba, and when they renovate, they keep 10% of the low-income people living there with modern apartments and displace 90% to 20 miles outside of town and in the squares that are now historic corridors that are Benetton rents. So they claim they're doing a social good for improving the housing of the vast majority and keeping about 10% there. Displacement is a condition that most people abhor, but people want because it shows that there's some other competition for the land value and the quality of life of a community. How you ameliorate this gentrification is really a social agenda that you need to put that balance within your own community, and people do it differently, whether it's a different society or a different culture, but it happens everywhere in the world.
The arts, Richard Florida for a long time, he's been on this program, his Rise of the Creative Class and his theories about the need for a creative class as important to economic growth.
Yes.
We're kind of considered almost like a Bible in a way for economic geographers and
yes, very much so.
Development.
Very much so.
But there's been some backlash, the ruse of the creative class and the fall of the creative class, with people pushing back and saying it's not as much of an economic engine to have all these creative people in here. And even if it is, it only benefits the people in that sphere. It doesn't, again, going back to what we're talking about, trickle down and help people in other areas of the economy.
Yeah, I'm actually a critic of Richard Florida, so I should state. I'm also a friend of Joe Kotkin, who's Richard Florida's main enemy, who's a fairly conservative thinker in residence at a conservative college in Southern California. I think they're both right. Richard Florida predicted that the young Gen Xers would be attracted back into the central cities if there was a density, if historic properties were maintained, if there was a new arts and cultural scene, and in that mixture of dense population of young people interacting and talking with new voices
which we see in Boise, by the way.
The new products would come, new industry would come, and new jobs would come. But that was interpreted primarily by chambers of commerce across America as attract the young and restless that are recent college graduates, don't give a darn about the older worker that needs job training, don't give a darn about the displacement of existing people. And I've attacked Richard publicly a number of times by saying the 55-plus worker that needs to be retrained is just as creative as the young person. If they were given skills in social media and communications, they would be as valuable a component of that downtown as the young college student would be. And we need to recognize that all of us are creative. It's not just the young and the restless from these colleges that are going to be attracted.
Well, and it's seen, and we have there's a great popularity of the Lifelong Learning Institute here that's attached to Boise State University, and there's one in Pocatello as well. Older people continuing to learn, continuing to grow. We will do a separate web extra on this idea of aging in place, but I know that this is a big initiative of partners. You were banging the drum before people even were really cognizant of it, but this looming, either opportunity or crisis, however you want to look at it, for the aging baby boomers. What are we going to do? Where are they going to live? How can they stay in place? Not everyone wants to move to a nursing home or assisted living.
Well, cities
and as you said, the retirees are an asset to
strong. Cedar City, Utah, not a small town, perhaps the same size as a number of your other communities, because the Shakespearean Theater has become a mecca for both culture and for creative retirees to move there, as opposed to going further south into basically, another town that's famous as a retirement town. But it's the Shakespeare Theater and the dynamic culture of Cedar City that is becoming the magnet in a sense.
But there are definitely issues with aging in place. How can you stay in your home and things like that? Or maybe homes should be built near universities, near libraries.
Well, there is a tremendous number of universities. I don't know whether Boise State has, but they should consider it. They're actually building the full spectrum on their own campuses or adjacent to the campus of independent living, dependent living, nursing home, and hospice on the grounds. You have that in Clemson, South Carolina, wholly contained within Clemson. They get free tickets to the athletic events and transportation. They can audit any courses. They can use the library, and they're hoping when they pass away they leave their money to Clemson, not to the alma mater they first went to. So Boise State should pick up on this idea.
You've talked about the need to attract the older person, the retiree, and also immigrants. You have said that if we can solve the immigration, quote, problem, again, maybe an opportunity, that if we solve it, it'll be our greatest asset in terms of the number of small businesses and even Fortune 50 companies that are formed by immigrants.
Yeah. If you look at the Fortune 50 companies over the last 20 years, over half of them have been formed by people that weren't born in America. And if we put our borders up against all comers, whether they're legal or illegal, whether they're from Iran or whether they're from Salvador, we will be missing out on people that will make a major contribution to our economic well-being. And I think the strength of America, even though we obviously have some safety issues, we have some illegal immigration issues, is that we are welcoming to people throughout the world that will bring their talents and their skills to power, hopefully, our economy, and hopefully our sense that we are all one. We're all people of one background. We are citizens of the world, and we have much in common, much more than we have difference.
How do you see social media, the internet, as facilitating the community these days?
I'm old enough that I don't really know, because that's a question that we need to ask a younger person, but I think it has the tremendous power to for good in terms of fundraising, in terms of even putting together venture capital, in terms of getting the word out, and it has the terrible thing of shortening everyone's attention span to 30 seconds.
Well, I'm just thinking about, I often find out about things that I wouldn't have known about.
Yeah.
By looking at social media, and there's a concert going on, or there's an art exhibit going on that I didn't know about.
So I'm sort of like the half dead, half alive. It's going to kill reading. It's going to kill society. It's going to kill conversation. We're going to all run over each other. Or it's going to bring a new era of opportunity.
Yeah, but do you believe that high-speed internet in communities is an amenity that's needed to move
For
forward?
example, Chattanooga was able successfully, after winning the Volkswagen landing contract, they got the federal government to put in the highest speed internet speed of any American city, and they're now billing themselves as the smartest city in America. And they've also designated, because the mayor of Chattanooga is chair of my board, they're the most aging-in-place friendly city in America. So they want to be manufacturing, they want to be intelligence, and they want to be aging. So you have to ride multiple horses to stay alive these days.
I'm sure you're well familiar with the criticism of some of not only what Partners does, but the smart growth movement, which you incorporate, and that is that this is social engineering.
Yes.
That a lot of people look at the types of things that you promote, denser housing, biking more, things like that, as taking away a very important sense of freedom, i.e. the car, i.e. I like living in suburbia. And some people go as far as saying, look, the car drives economy, because if you can't get in your car and go to all these different stores, you're not spending as much money. So they view it as you are limiting their choices. And it's a form of social engineering, what you're trying to get people to do in terms of developing the cities a certain
on
way.
my board of trustees, and the people I work with have ranged from President Bush as Secretary of the Treasury to First President Bush, head of the environment, to a number of mayors and governors. So I'm apolitical. And what I say is that each community should have that dialogue. Each community should decide what's the best balance, and each community should plan that the only constant is change, and they need to put in place a leadership group that thinks ahead, that anticipates some possible challenges to their quality of life and livability, and has the goodwill to reach across political and ideological fences to say, let's work together to make our community better.
And I've read in your writing to not tie that group to a particular individual. Like
exactly.
The mayor's group.
Because when the mayor's out of office, then what happens?
Right.
Or the governor leaves, or the corporate executive retires, or the philanthropic person passes away, and the children decide to spend the money on saving pet llamas in South America, like there's a foundation that's done that. So therefore, you cannot tie yourself to one flag. You have to have a team. A team wins games. One player does not win a game.
Speaking of llamas, what about animals? Animals as an important part of. We saw in Hurricane Katrina, people didn't leave their homes because they didn't want to leave their pets behind. And recently there was an article in the New York Times about the lengths to which people go to find an apartment or a condominium that will accept an animal as a quality of life issue.
We have a unique program in Philadelphia that I have to tell you about. There's a fairly large population of people over 65 living in poverty. And the Philadelphia Corporation on Aging hired an artist from New York to come and enrich their thinking. So she created a Gen X web and said, young people, let's get together. This is the Richard Florida people, and see, with our creativity, what could we do to make the lives better of these older, low-income people so we could have a better community? Well, the first idea they came up with is, why don't we go to the pet shelter and get dogs and cats and put them in the homes? Then someone said, but people won't have the money to feed them. Well, that means that we'll have to buy the food. Well, they'll need to go out for a walk. Well, that means we'll need to visit this old person every day, take the pet out for a walk, and bring food, forming a social bond between generations. And this is a wonderful idea that could be done in any community in Idaho, or any community in any place in America.
I need to ask you, as we wrap up, a little bit about your funding sources. You are funded in large part by banks, are you not?
We were before the banks
right.
had a serious trouble.
But you had taken money from them, and
Yes.
I wonder how you work that out in your own mind, because certainly banks are a target right now of having caused a lot of the problem that
Yes.
that we find ourselves in. lending money to people who shouldn't have gotten money, encouraging the housing boom that busted, and now, frankly, leaving some homes in complete disrepair in communities
True.
that drag the value down. So do you ever feel like this is not a source of income that you should derive when banks are seen that way?
Well, I mean, you've put me on the hot seat, so I'm going to plead innocent and guilty, both. The side of the banks that funded us was under their community reinvestment obligation, which is a bill passed by Congress that forces them to account for how they provide funding for low-income housing, for supporting minority enterprise, women-led firms. So we're funded by the good side of the banks. Remember, banks have good sides and bad sides. So we were funded by the good side, and we've been funded by Anheuser-Busch, but we do not advance that you drink more beer. But we have been funded by a number of different entities, but our principal funders now are the foundations.
Ford
The Ford Foundation was a major funder. MetLife Foundation funds our aging, but we're also working with Pfizer and Bayer Pharmaceutical, and we're working with a number of funders. So in a sense, we are guilty of accepting money from a variety of sources, but we have never accepted money to lobby. We've never lobbied before Congress or before City Council. We are just, and we've worked with people of all backgrounds and all parties, very conservative and very liberal, and we say if you can work together, you have a strength.
Well, as we close, we just have a couple minutes left. I've read you say something very interesting to me, and that is that people, if they're living in a town that's depressed or is having problems, that they should know that in about 10 years they really can turn the situation around. Flip side of that is, if you're gangbusters and you're doing really well, it can only be a matter of maybe 10, 20 years before it can all implode.
Very true, very true, very true.
So these are waves that rise and fall.
We will increasingly see those waves on a whole variety of fronts, and so as the high priest of livability, what I advance is be prepared, put in place a group that with a moment's notice can convene and say, we need to move forward with an agenda so that we can deal with that challenge, because we're looking at economic challenges, we're looking at human service challenges, we're looking at healthcare challenges, we're looking at local government finance challenges, we're looking at quality of life challenges, and that's going to be the norm.
Get that team together.
Yep.
That can
and if you have the team together, then you can face almost any conflict, any difficulty.
And why do you keep doing this after so many years? You could be retired, traveling around to Cuba and not working, I suppose, or Australia. I know you got to go to Australia a lot.
Yes.
What's the passion in it still for you?
One, I'm learning. Every time I go to a different community and talk to a different person, I learn something. Two, I get a chance to recycle some of that knowledge to help others. And three, I'm just an inveterate cheerleader of good opportunity,
Well, thanks so much for stopping by to talk with me and by proxy our viewers. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk a little bit more in a web extra about something that I know is close to your heart, which is the Aging in Place initiative. You've been listening to Robert McNulty of Partners for Livable Communities. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.